From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome now to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm going to check in on the markets right now. Joining us is Abigail Doolittle. So, Abigail, earlier we had Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, saying things were looking sort of good on stimulus. I thought the markets liked that. What happened?
Initially, the markets did like it. It's another topsy-turvy day here for stocks, David. So the S&P 500 was higher by about 0.3%, and then right around 10 o'clock, 10:20, took a dip lower ahead of Nancy Pelosi's press conference in anticipation perhaps of negative headlines. Then Nancy Pelosi came out saying we're quote unquote just about there on stimulus deal. The S&P 500 recovered, was slightly higher, now ever so slightly lower. So again, lots of uncertainty about what's going on. However, confirming the idea that perhaps you could see stocks stay about flat, maybe even turn higher. If we take a look at bonds, bonds are actually at this point lower on the day. Earlier, before that headline, bonds had been higher as investors were a little bit nervous, and so they were seeking that safety. Now you have the 10-year yield higher, interestingly, above that range we were talking about yesterday. So over the long run, if that continues, that could actually be a headwind. But today, you have to take it as a signal that investors not wanting havens, helping out the financial sector, one of the best sectors on the day. On the other hand, David, really pressuring stocks, the New York FANG complex, those mega cap tech stocks, that is down by 1%. So that part of the market still weighing overall on the S&P 500, while you have the financials and the energy and some of the other cyclical sectors that you want to see for a recovery doing well.
So, Abigail, talk about that FANG index particularly, because earlier you said to me the real story here isn't the overall index. It's actually what's going on with Amazon. What's going on with them? You know,
Amazon, this is really pretty interesting. So, of course, their two-day Prime event was last week. If you look at the stock from that event to today, almost in a correction, down nearly 10% from peak to trough. That is not a great sign. The stock is trading very poorly, underperforming its peers by about 5% over that same time period. And when you have a stock coming out of what should be a bullish event for the company into an earnings report, it suggests some sort of a hiccup could be ahead. Plus, Amazon now below its 50-day moving average. Technically, the bears are really trying to take over. It's going to be interesting to see what this company puts up next week, and it could be under pressure until we have more certainty there, too. Certainty and uncertainty, topsy-turvy, those seems to be the key words recently.
Pretty consistently, it seems to be. Okay, thanks so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. The Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, surprised us all yesterday by calling a news conference with FBI Director Christopher Wray and announcing that Iran was behind a series of intimidating messages sent to Democratic voters, and that both Iran and Russia have gotten access to voter registration information.
We have confirmed that some voter registration information has been obtained by Iran and separately by Russia. This data can be used by foreign actors to attempt to communicate false information to registered voters.
We welcome now an authority on election cybersecurity. Jake Braun is Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Initiative at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. He is also the author of Democracy in Danger: How Hackers and Activists Expose Fatal Flaws in the Election System. So welcome, Mr. Braun. Great to have you with us. So let's take from the title of your book. Did we see some danger to democracy in that announcement yesterday? From what we could tell, because there wasn't a lot of detail.
Yeah, so there was a few things that were disconcerting there. First of all, if it is Iran doing this, that means they've kind of clearly stepped up their activity. But it's kind of unclear if Iran is supposedly trying to hurt Trump, as the administration has said, then why are they telling Democrats not to vote via this, what seem to be fraudulent messages? So that's disconcerting. Secondly, kind of buried in the stories have been reports that DHS has notified election officials about holes, they said, in their websites and so on. Folks I've talked to says that these are vulnerabilities they found in election websites. The reason why that's really disconcerting is that we know from the Mueller report that the way that Russia hacked into the voter registration databases last year was through vulnerabilities in the websites. And, Russia got short shrift in these reports, and it'd be, interesting to know more about what Russia's up to and what's going on with these website vulnerabilities.
So you have so much more experience with this than I do. So give me some sense of the detective operation here to figure out who's behind these. As I understand it, there were messages sent to some voters basically saying, don't vote Democrat, vote for President Trump or we'll come after you. It seems like a pretty primitive form of tampering. Is that something that's similar to a fingerprint that Iran would have?
Well, I mean, yeah, this is the kind of big question mark that a lot of people have is, first of all, you wouldn't need to hack a list of voters to do that. I mean, you and I right now could go online and buy totally legally a list of email addresses for, let's say, Miami, Florida, where you're going to have about 85% of the people you email be Democrats, and send out, these, what seem to be illicit videos. So, how you tie that back to Iran, I think the administration needs to make a little bit more clear, of course, without releasing, methods and.
Sister Braun, can you still hear me? Hello, Jake Braun. I think we've had some technical difficulties there. The digital gremlins have gotten into the system, and we have lost Jake Braun, which is sad because he really knows this area so well, and we're trying to sort out what to make of this announcement late yesterday. It was Jake Braun. He is Executive Director for the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Coming up next, we're going to continue the countdown to the presidential election, and we're going to take a look at Nashville. Our chief correspondent down there is Kevin Cirilli. He's reporting on the presidential debate, which will happen tonight on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The second and final presidential debate will be in Nashville, Tennessee tonight. And our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli, is there to cover it for us. So, Kevin, give us a sense of what's going on down there in Nashville. How are they preparing?
Well, I just left the JW Marriott in downtown Nashville, where President Trump will host a small business roundtable of sorts with local Republican leaders here inside of Nashville, Tennessee. Meanwhile, he will be accompanied by the state's senator, Senator Marsha Blackburn, a deeply conservative senator also from Tennessee. In contrast, Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden has been really keeping a private schedule, and also his aides say preparing in earnest for what they are predicting will be a contentious debate. There are some changes stylistically from the first presidential debate. Remember, the second one was canceled, and that most notably is that there will be a mute button for the moderator of NBC News, Kristen Welker, to utilize should she feel that she needs it. On policy, some foreign policy developments just within the last 24 hours, no doubt, expected to come out. Chief amongst that press conference yesterday from the Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, who says that Iran and Russia cyber attacked the United States to get voter registration information. The Biden campaign will say that the Trump administration did little to better protect democratic institutions following 2016. In contrast, look for President Trump to try to raise questions about the Biden family's relationship with the Ukraine.
Yeah, I'll count on that. I don't think I'll be disappointed. Thank you so much, Kevin. Great to have you there, and looking forward to working with you tonight as we bring that debate to our audience on Bloomberg Television and Radio. To take us further into the stakes in tonight's debate and where it lies in the overall race, welcome now Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis. So, Rick, just specifically starting with the debate, what is at stake at this moment? Is there much at stake?
Well, I do think that the first debate, the first presidential debate, had some impact on the numbers positively for Biden. It looks like some of that has come back down since that debate to maybe close to pre-debate levels. So they do seem to be able to have an impact on voters who are still making up their minds or haven't voted. Since then, though, we've probably had, well, I know up to date, 44 million people have already cast their ballot. So time's running short for Donald Trump to mount a comeback. But I think that this is the last major event that really that can happen with.
So explain the Trump strategy here in saying he originally wanted to be all about foreign policy. He clearly wants to inject a fair amount of foreign policy. Is that offensive or defensive? Is that saying, boy, I've been so good on foreign policy, or the things I really want to bring up out of Vice President Biden's past?
A little bit of both, David. I mean, I think that he doesn't want to talk about COVID. I mean, that's pretty clear. And at a time when the country's rates, especially in the Midwest, are going significantly higher. And so changing the topic is really important to him. He has mounted an attack on Joe Biden's family and himself related to dealings with China and Ukraine. So he sees that actually as foreign policy. So it gives him an opening to try and enter in this corruption issue into the debate, which he did very successfully 4 years ago against Hillary Clinton. And then it does have some upside. There are foreign policy successes that Donald Trump's had in the Middle East that he hasn't had much time or effort or interest of talking about on the campaign trail. So this is set up well for him if he is able to stick to a message that is something that the voters will see as productive.
Rick, having been around so many of these debates through the years, what do you think that Vice President Biden learned or should have learned from that first debate?
Not to engage Donald Trump. Donald Trump's his own worst enemy in this debate format. Even though they will control the mics on the first set of 2-minute questioning, it's still going to have a free fall for every 10 minutes of follow-up. And so I think what Biden has learned from the first debate is not to engage, not to be angry, and not to come off of his script, which he did a good job when he had a solo effort on a town hall last week, stuck to policy and was able to make his points. So I think the trick for Biden is staying out of the wraps of Donald Trump.
Rick, when you talk about President Trump needing to stick to his message, what do you think that message is at this point? I mean, even today, he's released 37 minutes of an interview with Leslie Stahl from 60 Minutes, which is going to get a lot of people in the media, at least, really hot and bothered. Is that part of the message? I don't know. Everything seems a distraction right now.
Well, he's working the refs, right? I mean, Donald Trump is a master at this aspect of pre-debate policy, and that is setting expectations and working the refs. He knows that he isn't able to maintain a message discipline particularly well, and so he wants to blame all the negatives that are associated with him in the media on the media personalities and the reporters. And so, you know, if he can get tonight's moderator to feel like she needs to go out of her way to look like she's, quote, playing fair by Trump standards, he's already won part of the debate. And that's clearly a tactic that he's using right now.
Rick, what do you think President Trump's path to victory is at this point? I mean, a lot of commentators are, in my opinion, prematurely sort of saying this is almost over, if not over. But clearly, President Trump has a task ahead of him over the next 12 days. What's his path to victory, the best path to victory?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think you're exactly right. I think it's way too premature to claim that this election is over. There are a lot of states, Florida, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that are in striking distance for a election victory. Obviously, every day that there's early voting makes it a little bit tougher. But Trump's vote doesn't come out really until Election Day anyway, and so he's got some time to try and keep them and peel a few people off of Joe Biden in order to win. And in those states, if he could put together 4 or 5 of those states that we just talked about, he's got the ability to get to 270.
And is that his base? And is his base really at this point coming down to white males who lack a college education? Because that tends to be the people that people talk about who are really the most enthusiastic supporters of the president.
Well, that's certainly the core base of the Republican Party right now and his voters. But obviously, he is able to go beyond that. That would not be competitive on a national basis, nor in many of these states. And so really the trick for him is to how to pull back some of these seniors that he's been losing in October in key states like Arizona and Florida, where seniors are a key voting bloc, but also to try to get some penetration back to women suburban voters. He's been literally begging for them to come back to his fold. He got them in 16, but he doesn't seem to be able to put a message together that will bring them back this time.
But that's fascinating, Rick, because can he go after the seniors or after the suburban women voters without addressing COVID? Because a lot of polls indicate those voters are concerned about COVID.
that is his biggest dilemma. He doesn't want to talk about COVID. The news on COVID isn't very good. He wants to attack Joe Biden on the fact that he was talking about changing Social Security. I mean, he just wants to change the topic. And if he's successful, if he is able to be disciplined enough to actually create some questions about Joe Biden's commitment to issues that seniors care a lot about, maybe he can get a look back in his direction. But he knows that if he just sticks to the current issue set of COVID, the economy, and social unrest, he's not going to win.
Okay, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you with us. That's Bloomberg political contributor Rick Davis. And tune in tonight because Rick will be with me as well as with Kevin Cirilli for Bloomberg's special coverage of the final presidential debate. That's going to begin at 8:30 p.m. New York time. And we turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. Judge Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court will now go before the full Senate. The Judiciary Committee voted to advance her nomination today. All 12 Republican senators on the panel voted in favor of Barrett's nomination. Democrats boycotted the committee's vote. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says that the chamber will vote on Barrett's confirmation on Monday. A new stimulus package is in sight. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sounded an optimistic tone at her news conference today.
Pleased that we have reached a point where we at least, or they still haven't completely signed off on it, but I think we're just about there. That we will allocate again the resources and the policies necessary to do that.
Senate Republicans are the main roadblock to enacting a roughly $2 trillion deal being negotiated by Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has made no promises on when the Senate might vote on any agreement. In the UK, Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak has unveiled another bailout for businesses hurt by the coronavirus. The latest package is aimed at pubs and restaurants struggling under the UK's Tier 2 lockdown. The UK has raised job support aid, cutting employers' contributions. A judge has released hundreds of pages of testimony by Ghislaine Maxwell, the one-time girlfriend of disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein. It's the only substantive public record of what Maxwell said she did for Epstein. Maxwell is in jail in New York on charges she trafficked girls as young as 14 for Epstein to abuse. He was found dead in his jail cell last year. Authorities called the death suicide. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The Senate committees, the Judiciary Committee actually, has subpoenaed the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter. It wants them to come up and testify about allegations that they have suppressed a story about Hunter Biden's business dealings with Ukraine. The news comes as Facebook is seeking new ways to monetize its WhatsApp unit. Scarlett Fu is here with more. So, Scarlett, how are the stocks doing?
Well, the stocks are down overall, and you can see that big tech is really getting hit from all sides. Earlier this month, it was by the Democratic-controlled House Antitrust Committee, and of course today from the Republican-led Senate Judiciary Committee. And what today's action means is that Lindsey Graham, who's the chairman of this committee, is now clear to move forward with issuing subpoenas to Mark Zuckerberg and to Jack Dorsey, and really force them to testify over the decisions to limit sharing of New York Post articles about Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. There's been no date set yet, but both are scheduled already to explain their content policies next Wednesday before a different Senate committee. So the backdrop here is that after years of being left alone by Washington, especially in the early days, big tech is now constantly looking over its shoulder and is stuck in the crosshairs of lawmakers and regulators. So no real surprise that it has had to increase its spending on lobbying. Facebook, for instance, spent $16 million in 2019. $10 million so far this year, but all of that is kind of a drop in the bucket when you compare it to how much it has in cash. Facebook had $58 billion in cash last fiscal year, cash and short-term investments. Meantime, you mentioned the other headline there. Facebook is lining up a potential payout for its WhatsApp unit, the messaging service. Now, rather than selling ads, Facebook wants to offer its business users a cloud service that allows them to store and keep their interactions, their messages with their customers. This next phase after that would include payments to allow customers to buy products directly from businesses on WhatsApp. And really, this is a significant shift for Facebook, which makes almost all of its money through really targeted niche advertising. That's not to say that it won't pursue that necessarily, but it's looking into different options. And of course, the backdrop for all of this is that social media, big technology has done very well during the pandemic, deemed as kind of utilities more than anything else, although in the lead up to the election, there's a lot of concern over the role that they play in influencing how people think about candidates and how they vote.
So, Scarlett, let's be frank about something. We can talk about regulation all we want, but as long as people keep using Facebook, keep using Twitter, and they make money off of it, it's not going to change what they do really very much. Is there any prospect that some of this adverse publicity or regulation could actually deter people from using it?
I guess that's a big question. Even as people say that they don't want to use Facebook, they don't want to contribute to it, in the past they have tried to withdraw from Facebook and then say they're going to use Instagram instead. But of course, Facebook owns Instagram. So there's that tricky situation where it doesn't really matter if you boycott Facebook as long as you go to another part of Facebook's empire. And WhatsApp is a different proposition entirely because it does rely more on, say, business customers than it would on consumers and or people who are just having social interactions with each other on the app. So there's that complication too. All this will come to a head, of course, during the earnings season, and Facebook will be reporting earnings later on. And of course, Facebook Nation is still more than 1 billion strong. So as long as there is utility for Facebook, the advertisers can boycott for short term, but they're not going to abandon Facebook entirely.
Okay, so while we're talking about earnings, just briefly here at the end, I think let's go to the other end of the spectrum if we can, which is railroads. Go all the way from social media to railroads. I know you've been looking at Union Pacific. What did we learn today?
Yeah, Union Pacific, along with the other transportation companies, had really high expectations heading into the third quarter earnings season. In fact, more than 70% of analysts surveyed by Bloomberg had raised their EPS and revenue estimates for the company. So when Union Pacific reported results and posted declines for both the top and bottom line, it was bigger than expected because those expectations had been raised. So on the one hand, while it is improving operational efficiencies, the concern there is that volume is still not recovering, and that is due in large part to the fact that the industrial economy, while it's recovering, has not yet recovered. It's still in recovery mode, and we're still seeing double-digit declines in things like bulk freight and industrial freight, and that's not going to change probably in the near term. Bloomberg Intelligence thinks that it won't reach an inflection point until 2021. Okay,
Scarlett, thank you so very much for those reports. That's Scarlett Fu, our colleague. A programming note now, tune in tonight for Bloomberg's special coverage of the final presidential debate that begins at 8:30 p.m. New York time. We'll be joined by pollster Frank Luntz, as well as Bloomberg contributors Rick Davis and Jeannie Zaino. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Both President Trump and former Vice President Biden have said that the stakes could not be higher for this year's election for a whole host of reasons. And now, with less than 2 weeks to go, we hear from the Director of National Intelligence that Iran and maybe Russia are trying to interfere. Welcome now someone whose responsibilities in the Obama administration included helping safeguard our election process. He is the former Attorney General of the United States. He is Eric Holder. General Holder is now serving as chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. So thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Attorney General. Start with this news overnight, first of all. We don't know very much. There weren't many details. Does it surprise you that Iran and perhaps Russia would be trying to send disinformation to really tamper with our elections?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all. And I think that, we need to be prepared for these kinds of intrusions, these kinds of attempts to, interfere with our electoral system. What struck me as a little strange was just the press conference that was held last night. The information that was shared was not particularly something that was unanticipated, but to try to spin it as an attack on the Trump administration and the Trump campaign, as opposed to an attack on the American electoral system, I thought was just a little different and unexpected.
And also, I'm not an authority on this. You are. It seemed a little primitive to have supposedly Proud Boys send some email messages saying, if you don't vote for President Trump, we're coming after you? Is that really the way Iran would go after something like that, or Russia for that matter?
Yeah, I mean, you see these intrusions in a number of ways. Some of them are extremely sophisticated. Some of them are, as you say, pretty crude. And so they just really run the gamut. What the American people need to be aware of is everything that you see on the internet is not necessarily accurate. There are a whole range of motives why things are posted, both by foreign actors as well as people acting domestically. And then I think it's incumbent upon our intelligence agencies working with their state and local partners to push back and to try to filter as much of this as is possible. And I think the private sector and the platforms that through which much of this stuff passes have a responsibility as well.
Eric, one thing that both sides of the aisle basically agree on is that the stakes are really high in this election. And we in the media tend to focus on the presidency, of course, and the Senate, because it might flip, might not flip, and the House of Representatives. But you really have an initiative focusing on something longer term and frankly, farther down the ballot. And that is the question of redistricting and why this is a particularly important year right now because of the census. Explain what you're up to.
Yeah, I mean, I understand. I get it. This is an existential election. However, you decide that, you want to vote. This is obviously a very important presidential election. But we really have to focus on these down ballot races. We're going to go through a redistricting process in 2021, and the people elected this year will be the ones who will help draw those lines. I'm the head of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and we're trying to make sure that the process in 2021 is a fair one, and that the lines are drawn not to protect incumbents, but to make sure that elections are competitive, and that we end up with representatives at the state level who will represent the interests of the people and not the special interests. And people need to understand that on a day-to-day basis, you're probably more impacted by who serves in your state legislature than you are by the president of the United States when you're concerned about criminal justice reform, protecting a woman's reproductive rights, protecting the right to vote, a lot of healthcare decisions. These are decided, as I said, more in the state legislature than they are in Washington, D.C.
So this comes up because the census, according to the Constitution, has to happen every 10 years, and this is one of the 10 years. And ironically, this time it's with the presidential, which doesn't happen that often. I guess every 20 years that happens more or less. What happened 10 years ago?
Well, 10 years ago, we ended up with a process that Princeton University said was the most gerrymandered redistricting effort of the last half century. Republicans used the power that they got in the 2010 midterms to really draw the lines in a way that favored them, and we had to deal with that over the course of the last 10 years. What my organization is trying to do is to make sure that we just have a fair process, one that doesn't favor Democrats, one that doesn't favor Republicans, one that doesn't gerrymander for either party, but just draws the lines in a fair way. I worked with Arnold Schwarzenegger on this effort. He and I have a piece that's out in Missouri today trying to protect something that we helped put in place there, which was a nonpartisan redistricting commission that will draw the lines, take the power away from self-interested politicians, and put it in the hands of a neutral body. Passed by the citizens of Missouri. Politicians there are now trying to weaken it. He and I did an op-ed that posted today that said, don't do that, push back against these politicians and preserve that neutral body.
So, Eric, you took us just where I wanted to go, which was to say, now you're representing the Democrats on this. Would you be willing to take it out of the political sphere and give it to a bipartisan commission? Or is it more a matter of we want to make sure our Democrats control the state houses so that we get to gerrymander?
No, I actually think that the best way, the gold standard, is to create these nonpartisan commissions. They already exist, have existed for some time in Arizona and in California. We were instrumental in getting them put into Michigan, Missouri, Colorado, and Utah, and they will be doing the redistricting next year. I think that's the gold standard. That is the best way to do it. Politicians, whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, are going to try to, protect their districts, protect their party, put it in the hands of these nonpartisan bodies. That way, you will end up with, I think, the fairest line drawing, and you will end up with legislatures that are more beholden to the people as opposed to the special interests. And I think if we have a fair process, let me be very clear. I think Democrats and progressives will do just fine. But I don't want to gerrymander for Democrats. Let's let independent commissions draw the lines.
Eric, the Supreme Court is very much on all of our minds right now. We have Judge Amy Coney Barrett today being referred to the full Senate for what looks like will be a confirmation next week. To what extent does the Constitution limit, or the Supreme Court limit, the degree of gerrymandering? I know that for some reasons you cannot gerrymander, for example, for race. But what about when it comes to politics? Could that be a limiting factor, or could it be actually the reverse of that if we have a 6-3 conservative majority, which is what some people call it?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court, in a decision just this past year, which I think was wrongly decided, said that the federal courts cannot hear partisan gerrymandering cases. Federal courts are still open to hear racial gerrymandering cases. And so as a result, we've had to bring lawsuits in the state courts using the state constitutions when we wanted to attack partisan gerrymandering schemes. I think that decision was wrong. I think the federal courts are uniquely situated to deal with questions of gerrymandering, whether they be partisan or racial in nature. So the courts clearly have an important role to play here. My hope would be that the courts will stay open to hearing racial gerrymandering cases. My hope also will be that ultimately the court would reverse itself and recognize that the decision that they made in the Ruchko case was a wrong one, and open the federal courts up to partisan gerrymandering cases as well.
Eric, more generally, how concerned are you, as formerly our foremost lawyer in the country, about legal challenges and disputes coming out of this election? Are we going to have a clean election?
Yeah, I think we are. I mean, I think we got to be prepared, for cases being the election, parts of the election being decided in the courts. And I think you might see a lot of litigation leading up to the election when decisions are being made about, signature matches on votes by mail, how long polling places should stay open, all those kinds of things. But I actually think that the turnout is going to be sufficiently large, and I suspect the decision of the American people is going to be pretty decisive. So I don't really anticipate that the courts will play a significant role post-election, but it's clear that both campaigns are getting ready, have lawyers all around the country, and prepared to litigate whatever might surface.
Yeah, it would be awfully nice to let the voters decide rather than the courts. I think we both can agree on that.
That'd be a good thing.
Exactly. Okay. Thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. That's Eric Holder. He's the former Attorney General, and he's now chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The coronavirus could deplete Social Security by 2030, 5 years earlier than the official government estimate. That's according to a new report from the Bipartisan Policy Center. It predicts the effects that the recession and the long-term near-zero interest rates triggered by the pandemic will have on Social Security. Even under the most optimistic economic projections, the center says the fund could run out of money by 2034. The United States has added 6 more Chinese publications to a list of media outlets that it says are being controlled by Beijing. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. isn't restricting what the outlets can publish in the U.S. He says it's a tool for Americans to differentiate between, quote, news written by a free press and propaganda distributed by the Chinese Communist Party. China called the move unjustified and vowed to retaliate. A leading international human rights group says a Lebanon-led probe into that massive port explosion in Beirut this summer hasn't yielded any credible results. Human Rights Watch says the investigation has been marred by political meddling and lack of judicial independence. It's pushing Lebanon to accept an independent probe. The August blast killed nearly 200 people and wounded more than 6,000. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. We continue our Swing State series, look at Pennsylvania with Reverend Joe Watkins of Philadelphia. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. All this week, we're looking at Pennsylvania as part of our Swing State series leading up to the election. And today, we welcome the Reverend Joe Watkins. He's former White House aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush, and he is host of State of Independence. You can find that at joewatkins.org. So, Joe, thanks so much for being with us. We've been talking to various people about Pennsylvania, what's going on there. Give us your sense about the race right now, particularly at the presidential level, between President Trump and the former Vice President Biden. What does it look like in Pennsylvania?
Well, you know, of course, people say that Joe Biden is from Scranton, Pennsylvania, originally, and he plays really well in the Pennsylvania suburbs and certainly in northeastern Pennsylvania, where he's from. I would say that no matter what the polling data tells you, that the race is probably a lot closer in Pennsylvania than anybody would care to say. And I say that because Donald Trump did so well in the last cycle in 2016 with non-college educated whites, many of whom are Democrats. So these would be blue-collar Democrats as well as Republicans who haven't gone to college. He does extraordinarily well with that demographic. And last time he did really well in the T, what we call the T in Pennsylvania. So, you know, the northern part of the state, the center, and then a little bit of the south. But certainly those rural districts which have Democratic voters, but even the Democrats in those districts in large number went for Donald Trump. So I'm supposing that you could expect a lot of that. We don't yet know the impact that the coronavirus economy will have on the attitudes of voters. But if this cycle is at all similar to the last cycle, don't be surprised if you see a disproportionate share of blue-collar Democrats voting for Donald Trump and making the race very, very tight in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Joe, I think there's a little question that the core of the core for President Trump are, as you say, those non-educated white males to a large degree. At the same time, last time when President Trump eked out, I think it's fair to say, a victory in Pennsylvania, he picked up some women in the suburbs in Philadelphia as well. He didn't win overall, but certainly he did better than people had expected him to be. How does that looking?
I think it's a tougher haul with him with suburban women. College-educated suburban women haven't been pleased with some of the tone, some of the rhetoric. They don't like anything that looks like racism or overt racism. They haven't been pleased with these sad instances with the police killings of people of color that have happened over the last year. And I think many of them are going to vote for Joe Biden, including Republican suburban women, because they want to make a statement. So I think that suburban women in this cycle will probably be harder for President Trump than they were in the 2016 cycle. So I'm not sure that he's going to be able to rely on their vote. And I think they're going to come out in big numbers. David, turnout is going to matter in this whole election because polls are one thing, but what really matters, as we all know, is who turns out to vote on election day. And in this case, we have so many voters that have already voted. Right. So very few undecideds. People have already shown up in big numbers to vote. And those who are going to show up on election day, I think, are very motivated on both sides.
And so that's my final question, Joe, actually. Is this a matter of persuading some people who might change their minds the last time, or is it just a matter of people have really made up their minds, just a question of who turns up?
I think it's the second. I think that there are very few undecideds in this race. I think that the number of undecideds would be minuscule. People already know what they're going to do, what they're likely to do, and it's just a matter of whether or not they are incentivized to do it in their minds, whether they are enthusiastic about doing it. I think that one of the things that has helped President Trump in the past is the enthusiasm of his base of support. So I think his voters will show up to vote on Election Day. And for Joe Biden, the question is who will show up to vote? Will African Americans, especially in cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, show up in big numbers to vote for him?
Okay, Joe, it's always such a pleasure to have you with us. That is the Reverend Joe Watkins. He's a former White House aide to President George Herbert Walker Bush. Coming up here, U.S. Secretary of Labor Eugene Scalia will join us with the latest on the state of jobs and what we learned from the jobless claims out earlier today. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. U.S. initial jobless claims and continuing claims fell again last week for the third time in the last 4 weeks. Still, the number of Americans on extended benefits actually rose. To give us the perspective on these numbers and what they tell us about the employment situation overall as we head toward that election, welcome now Eugene Scalia. He is the United States Secretary of Labor. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. What is your take on it? As I say, they're going down, but they're still elevated well above where they were before the pandemic.
David, it's good to join you again. And yes, this was a very encouraging report. We showed initial claims filings. That means people coming and asking to be qualified for unemployment benefits. We saw the number we reported today was 110,000 lower than the number that was reported out a week ago. It is the lowest number we've seen since March. And then you mentioned continuing claims. That's people whose claims have been approved and are now receiving benefits. We know now that in the month of September, 3 million people went off unemployment, which is quite encouraging about the direction of the recovery. And for the last week for which we have full data, we know that 1 million people just in that week came off unemployment. So the trajectory is strongly in the right direction. But as you say, these numbers are high. We need to continue to bring them down. We are bringing them down much more quickly than was being predicted back in April or even May. We've put back 11.4 million jobs through September. You know, in the last economic downturn during the financial crisis in the Obama administration, it took nearly 3 years to get unemployment under 8.5%. We've gotten it under 8.5% in just 4 months. So it's a strong recovery headed back to that strong economy that we had pre-COVID.
So, Mr. Secretary, I guess that question is, have we got a lot of the low-hanging fruit, if I can put it that way? And what I'm really asking is, we hear a lot of people now saying, okay, some of the jobs are coming back and have come back. There may be some jobs that never come back because we've had permanent changes to the employment structure. How is the Labor Department assessing that? Do you have any sense of how many jobs we may lose over the longer structural term? And what can we do about that?
Yeah, I do want to be clear, David, that this is not job completed. This is not a situation where we're looking at this, resting back and saying we've done what we needed to do. There still is important work to be done. I do think that there are a lot of encouraging signs about the job markets and the economy generally. We had a really good existing home sales number today, good retail sales numbers last week. And just one other interesting job market report we put out on Tuesday, the report regarding state unemployment rates. We know the national rate is 7.9%. We saw that a couple weeks ago, but now we know what it is in individual states. For a majority of states, it's 6.7% or lower. There are 3 states really stick out: California at 11%, and New York and Illinois at about 10%. Those are 3 of our 5 largest states. They're having a harder time for whatever reason bringing people back to work. The national picture looks better. I think that we will continue to put jobs back, David, but we do have to recognize that there are some sectors like conventions, I think to an extent airlines, that are going to take longer, although there was some good news coming out today as well about airline use. We had a couple airlines saying that passengers are coming back at a higher rate now, and the TSA numbers are picking up. So a lot of progress. Still more to be done, but I do think that we can continue this, especially given the progress that we're making with the vaccine as well. There's very good news on that front.
Mr. Secretary, I also like to address a larger issue as well, and it's under OSHA, it's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and we've talked about it before. I know you think that you're doing what you need to do, but give us your sense overall, almost philosophically. I assume you agree there should be regulation of employers to ensure safety and health. You think maybe the balance has gotten out of kilter. Where is the proper balance? How do you think about that problem? How do you strike that balance?
I think we have the right balance now, David. First of all, OSHA, which is part of the Labor Department, has been communicating to workers and employers about COVID safety since all the way back in January. They've put out really voluminous guidance for different industries and the workers in those industries about the things to do safe and to stay safe. And then something that's changed since you and I have spoken about this before, David, is there's now concrete publicly visible evidence of the fact that we are indeed going to bring cases where we find that employers are not taking appropriate steps to take their workers, to protect their workers. We've now brought nearly 100 citations against employers that did not take steps needed to protect their employees. We will continue to conduct inspections, continue to bring cases where we need to. And there were some that were saying 3-4 months ago, oh, OSHA's not coming to your workplace. It's not going to cite employers. I told you at the time they were wrong, and you're seeing it now. Investigations are being completed. Employers that aren't taking proper steps are being cited. But that said, I've been doing labor and employment work for nearly 30 years. I have never seen employers as focused on their workers' health and safety as they are now, because they know that if they don't keep them healthy and safe, that they risk having to shut down. They're concerned about customers too. So we are continuing to help all those employers that are trying to do the right thing. But we will, as I've said from the start, engage in enforcement against those who don't.
Okay, thank you so much. That's Eugene Scalia. He's U.S. Secretary of Labor. And we want you to join us tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time for the last presidential debate. This is Bloomberg.